This session is part of Town and Country's ongoing financial wellness workshop series, where we cover lots of different topics, from estate planning to credit basics to planning and saving for college, and a lot of other things as well. I want to welcome our members for joining, and thank you for joining us tonight, and also to welcome the families, students, and educators from our local school community. So thanks for being here with us tonight. We all know that education after high school can be really expensive and that costs continue to rise. Plus, young people more and more are finishing school burdened with a lot of student debt. So we're bringing this workshop together tonight to help in being able to avoid some of that for families and for the kids, which the student debt, as we've seen with research is showing that a lot of people aren't willing or aren't able to get started with the rest of their life because they're paying student debt for years. We are taking a look at some different strategies and some different ways that you and your family can work to afford education after high school and to be able to reach your goal of educating your kids. So at Town and Country, we're committed to helping families reach these goals, and being prepared for your kids' education is one of them. That's very important. So to provide some strategies and insights into the college planning process, we have teamed up with the Finance Authority of Maine and invited two of their experts on the topic to join us tonight. Mary Dyer is a financial education officer with FAME, providing college access, financial education, debt management services, and training to Maine students, families, as well as professionals who support them. Mary also serves as president of the Maine Jumpstart Coalition for Personal Financial Literacy. It's a nonprofit volunteer-based organization that's dedicated to improving financial capabilities of Maine children and young folks. Mary is joined by Mila Tappan. Mila is FAME's manager of college access and outreach, and a FAFSA expert working with family, students, and professionals on completing the FAFSA process and securing financial loans and support for higher education. And I sure wish I would have known Mila about 6 or 7 years ago when my sons were going through the college process. We do have a lot to cover tonight, and so we're going to hold questions to the end. If you do have questions throughout the course of the presentation, we ask that you post them in the chat, and Mary and Mila will address them, the things that they don't cover in their presentation when we're done. So, and just one other reminder, please be sure to keep your audio muted throughout the presentation, so that helps us to minimize any other background noise. So without any other hesitation, I'm going to turn this over to Mary Dyer and Mila Tappan.
Great. Thank you so much, Linda. And thank you so much to Town and Country and all of you for, inviting us to be part of this and having Mila join you for this, what we feel is an extremely important topic. Mila and I both come to you with a wealth of knowledge and experience in higher education financing. She and I both worked in financial aid offices for many, many years. But I think more importantly, we come to you as parents of college students. We both have students in college right now, and Mila actually has an older student who has finished college and gone on and graduated with his master's degree. So we really will be providing throughout this presentation information and resources and tips that we have found as parents to be invaluable. Until you go through the process as a parent, all of the knowledge that you have as a professional comes in handy, but certainly that parental experience is huge. So really the goal for tonight is to provide you with information, resources, and tools to help you navigate, plan, and pay for higher education. And I know you're all in various stages of this. Some of you have middle school students, perhaps younger. Some of you have high school students, probably even college students or beyond. And so we hope to really, as a goal, arm you with the information that you will need to navigate this process. Ideally, we want you to have as many options as possible going into the future, both for you and for your child. And so we really want to be sure to leave you with some great information. Now, that being said, this presentation, we want you to know this isn't your only opportunity to receive help from FAME. We have a number of resources and tools and webinars, and we'll provide information about that at the end of the presentation. But we also have a very knowledgeable customer service team and our college access team who can talk with you one-on-one via Zoom, via email, via phone, to help you navigate your very unique specific circumstances. So there's a lot of information in this presentation. We could do an hour on many of these topics individually. So we're really going to just touch on these things, but we want you to know that we're here for you now and in the future to help you through this process. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. So tonight, what we're going to be doing is really focusing on 3 key areas. The first being sort of the financial preparedness, some of the steps that you can take related to finances, not just saving for college and paying for college, but sort of that more holistic view. Then I'm going to turn it over to Mila, and really the meat of this presentation is to help you understand some of the resources and strategies to help you build a list of colleges. And one thing I want to note here is we're not going to be diving into admissions criteria or degree programs or sort of academic fit. We're really going to be focusing on financial fit. And really, how can you right now, early on in the process, get a handle on, what colleges have to offer in terms of financial aid and what that, end result will be in terms of your cost and your financial commitment. And then we'll talk about comparing aid offers and financing options. So above and beyond financial aid, how do you pay the bill and what are some of the options there that are available? So I want to dive right into the first step, and this is one that's certainly near and dear to me and all of us at FAME in terms of our financial wellness focus. And this is really to, think about those financial aspects more globally and those financial conversations that you should be having as a family and with your students. It's really important as early as possible to begin talking with your child, and whether they're middle school, high school, or beyond, about money, and really beginning to open up those conversations if you haven't already. We acknowledge that families are sort of the primary influencer. Parents and families are a primary influencer for students when it comes to their financial knowledge and behaviors. And so we want you to really think about ways that you can expand those conversations and offer those learning opportunities for your child or children. However, we recognize that it's not easy, that a lot of parents are reluctant to have those conversations. A recent study, in fact, noted that 69% of families or parents are reluctant to have those conversations, and that many families and parents are more uncomfortable talking about money and finances than they are in discussing the birds and the bees. So we recognize that these are sometimes tough conversations to have, but they're critically important. We know that in looking at a lot of the data, families in many cases don't feel that they have the knowledge and experience themselves, or perhaps their finances aren't quite where they would like them to be. So to talk about that with our kids can be difficult and uncomfortable, but it will really pay off in the long term. The earlier that you can begin to have candid conversations about finances and expectations around college financing, the better off your children will be. In fact, another study that we've cited here is that millennials with student loan debt, indicated that by and large, they inherited their attitudes about financial responsibility from their parents. And 53% of them said that if they'd had those conversations earlier on, it would have decreased potentially the amount of student loan that they borrowed. So it really is an important topic, and one that we hope that you'll focus on. Now, the other thing that we encourage families to do is to sort of begin working toward or continuing your efforts to get your own financial house in order. And again, this isn't just about saving and planning to pay for college, but what about your other financial matters, and how might you improve your financial outlook so that you can contribute to, college savings or help with those tuition payments. And so one of the things we want you to be thinking about is ways that you can work toward paying off debt, especially things like credit card debt, just generally reducing your overall financial obligations to free up money in your budget to help pay for college. On the flip side, this might not be the best time, especially for those of you who have a child who's, emerging and going to be in college soon, to take on new financial obligations. It might not be the best time for that. You really want to evaluate those decisions. We also think it's a great time to consider ways to increase available income, both for you and your child. Things like, do you have a rental income opportunity? Is there a side hustle or an opportunity for summer employment? Part-time jobs. And I know right now it's not an easy time to, explore additional employment opportunities and increasing income, but that's certainly one strategy that can really help for some families. Another thing, and I've already touched on this, is to really think about ways to free up as much money as you can in your budget. Think about renegotiating your insurance costs, your interest rates. Now's a really good time to think about refinancing, reevaluating what you're paying for your cell phone and your internet and all those monthly regular expenses. Can you free up as much money as possible and in turn perhaps contribute those found resources, if you will, into college savings? As much as you can contribute now, no matter where you're at in the process, every little bit is going to help. One of the strategies for me that I found worked for me that I like to give as a tidbit, I didn't save as soon as my oldest son was born. I didn't start contributing to his 529. I wish I had, or at least when he went from daycare to kindergarten. So I didn't save early enough. And so when we got into 4th and 5th grade and middle school, I really felt that I needed to catch up. And so while he was in high school, I really socked away as much as I could possibly manage within my budget into his 529 account and really began to adjust to not having that available money each month. And then once he was in college, I diverted that money into his tuition payment plan, and Mila will talk about what those are later. But just think about how much, can you sort of set aside now, and how can you sort of free up money to divert that? As I mentioned before, it's really important to begin having conversations, discussing your plans and your capacity to pay for college. And that might be as much, as candid as a conversation of, here's what we can afford to pay. Here's what we can contribute. Here are the expectations that we would like to set for these future plans. And I think that that's really helpful because as your child is looking at various college options, and we're going to help you, have some tools and ways to sort of get a handle on what those costs will be. But as your child is looking at that, having an understanding of your capacity to pay and what the expectations are can be very, very helpful. So really laying the groundwork for that and beginning that early conversation around what is manageable is very, very important. And ultimately, we find, families who are unprepared, who haven't sort of started having these conversations and taken some of these steps, they just find themselves with fewer options. And so we really hope that this presentation is really going to help you expand the options that you will have later on. Now, does that mean that you'll be able to save every penny to cover education and college? Absolutely not. For most families, that's not a reality. And so we'll talk about how do you, pull together your available resources to get the bill paid. But every little bit certainly does help. So I mentioned several times already the importance of saving and saving often and saving early, even if it's just a small amount. One thing that many students and families are, I think, often surprised about is that most schools do not meet full financial need. And that's even for, in the case of our lowest income students who have a 0 expected family contribution, and we'll talk about that later. Even in those cases, many of those students have a gap. And when I say gap, that is basically defined as, in some cases, several $1,000s that they still have to pay, even though they have a 0 expected family contribution. And so many families are surprised by that. They are expecting that there'll be, in some cases, more funds available than there are. On the flip side, we also encounter many, many middle income families and beyond who find when they see that expected family contribution for the first time, it's higher than they anticipated. So again, savings is a really great way to bridge that gap and to help make, you know, the college financing process more manageable and to help reduce the amount of student loans that the student has to borrow. One other thing that I think we hear sometimes commonly from parents and even grandparents is, well, I just worked in the summer and I was able to pay my tuition and fees and I just worked, you know, that pull yourself up by your bootstraps and go get a job. And, you know, for many students, that's just not a reality in terms of college costs at this point. And so while summer earnings are very helpful in terms of buying books and supplies and maybe contributing to tuition, and, you know, certainly for students who are studying in the community college system, sometimes that can certainly make you know, have the summer earnings can be a big contribution, but it's not a reality for paying the full cost for most students. The other thing we want you to know is that savings is critical and helpful to get the bill paid, but it's also not going to hurt you. It's not going to hurt your financial aid eligibility, and it's not going to limit the financial aid that you would receive. And so please keep that in mind. I noticed in a lot of the questions that we received when you registered, there was a lot of concern about savings and how will it impact my financial aid eligibility. And the reality is savings will have little to no impact whatsoever. And that's a myth we want to debunk here with you tonight and going forward. And so I'm going to show you, I'm not going to tell you, I'm going to actually just show you. So these are a couple of charts, these next two slides give you a breakdown of the expected family contribution. And this is based on a family of 4 with 1 child. And so on this first slide, it's giving you the total income for 4 families ranging from $45,000 to $75,000. In none of these cases do the families have any countable assets. And I say countable assets because not all assets are counted in the financial aid and FAFSA formula. Our biggest assets for most families, as a matter of fact, the value of the home you live in, your primary residence, and the value of your retirement account, those are not included as assets in the formula. So countable assets, that's sort of after, you know, those allowances and all of those things that aren't counted. In these cases, and in this scenario, these families do not have any countable assets. So you'll see very quickly what happens with that expected family contribution. And of course, there's no portion from assets, but it's all coming from that income. And you'll see, you know, in family A, it's $994, but, you know, $30,000 increase in income, and we get up into the $6,500 EFC. So you'll see how that EFC can rise very quickly based on income. One thing I want to emphasize before I move to the next slide to show you the impact of assets is that the financial aid formula is primarily and largely income driven. It is truly not driven by assets, and your savings for the vast majority of families is not going to have any impact whatsoever. And so let's look at that on the next slide. And again, this is excluding your home and your retirement, all of those things that I've talked about. So this is a scenario, 4 scenarios for a family, again, family of 4 with 1 child, earning $65,000 a year. And in each of the scenarios, it's showing various savings, you know, amounts that they have available. So again, those countable saving assets. And so you're seeing scenario A, they don't have any savings. Scenario B, it's 10,000, and then 15,000 and 20,000. And so you'll see in those 3 scenarios. So once again, their EFC from their income, you're seeing that's $4,300, $4,387. And then look at the contribution from the assets. Look how limited and insignificant that family contribution increases because of those available assets. You know, for that family who has $20,000 in assets, so imagine that that's $20,000 that they have saved in a 529 account, it's merely $564 that it increases that expected family contribution. And imagine what that $20,000 can do in terms of helping that family to finance. So it absolutely has no impact or little impact whatsoever. This comes right from the federal formula. You can actually go online and see the financial aid formula. There are lots of, and we'll show you some tools in a little bit, that you can do some forecasting and some calculators to figure out, you know, based on your income, what would your EFC be, and if you add assets or take assets out, so you can play along with the numbers. There's a lot of calculators online. But the bottom line and the important point here is that assets are not what determines financial aid eligibility. It truly is income. So some of you asked in the registration, you know, what are some ways to save? How should we be saving? And certainly there are a number of different savings vehicles, college savings options. There's certainly no one right way or best way. It really depends on your family circumstances and your objectives. So we encourage you, I'm not going to do a deep dive into any one of these. We encourage you to visit savingforcollege.com, where you'll find information about many of the various college savings options. One of the most popular being the 529 college savings option. And virtually every state has a 529 college savings plan that you can participate in, and you don't even actually have to live in that state to use that plan. Maine also has its own college savings plan, its own 529 plan, and it's called NextGen. And again, you'll find information about every state's plan on savingforcollege.com, but you can learn about NextGen by visiting nextgenforme.com. Each state is a little bit different. It's structured a little bit different. Some states have certainly different features. In Maine, we do have some grants for Maine residents, so I encourage you to take a look at that if you're unaware. One other point, and again, not going to do a deep dive into each of these. That's a whole other hour-long presentation. But one thing to note is that it is best when you're saving to save in the parent's name, not in the student's or another family member. And that's because that asset, certainly that asset calculation that we talked about earlier, is much smaller for the parent. So the absolute maximum percentage that would be calculated against your assets is 5.64%. So that's the maximum, but most families it's much lower than that. When the assets are in the student's name, it's a 20% attributed to that. And so just keep that in mind. One other note is if you do save in a 529 plan, even if it's in the student's name, the student is the account owner, it's considered a parent asset for the purposes of the FAFSA. So we just want you to be aware of that. And again, lots of other opportunities to get information about savings plans and strategies around college saving, but I just wanted to highlight the 529 and give you that resource so that you can look at other options. Now I'm going to turn it over to Mila, who's going to talk about how to begin looking at building a list of schools and how to do some research to get a sense of costs and net price.
So thank you. I'm so glad you're here with us today, and we're so excited to talk about this, even though it's a scenario that sometimes can feel a little bit overwhelming. You know, the earlier you get information, the better. And thank you, Mary, for getting us off on a great start. And all of those conversations and all of that that you can do as early as possible is going to be absolutely wonderful and so helpful. What I'd now like to talk about, Mary, if you can just advance me a slide, is I want to talk about researching schools. And I want to talk about researching schools specifically from a financial aid perspective. So when we're talking about looking at schools, there's going to be all sorts of people who are going to be able to help your student find schools based on the major that they're looking for, their program study, or even the location. But not a lot of people are going to talk about you researching them from the financial aid perspective. So that's where we come in, because that, I think, is a really important criteria when people are building the list and looking for the schools that their children are going to be attending in the future. And as Mary's mentioned, the schools vary dramatically in terms of the types and amount of financial aid that they can offer. So I want to start by just talking about two very broad categories of financial aid. First, there's merit-based aid. So all of you might be familiar with merit-based aid. We talk about that as being kind of like the scholarships. Those are the types of aids, that type of aid that you don't have to repay. And they're going to be the funds, though, that are awarded based on academic performance, maybe athletic ability from the individual department at a college, because if the student is someone that they want to have there because they're so strong academically. So merit-based aid is wonderful, and it's awarded again by either the admissions office, the athletic department, or maybe the department of the student is going to be attending, like the engineering department at a particular school. So that's super important aid. But then need-based aid is what we tend to focus the most on. So need-based aid is the financial aid that is awarded by the financial aid office. So every school has a financial aid office, and they determine who is going to be eligible for need-based aid. And the way that students receive need-based aid is by filling out an application. So the one that you might have already heard about first is the FAFSA, the Free Application for Federal Student Aid. So the FAFSA is used by absolutely every school out there that has aid toward federal financial aid. They have to use the FAFSA to determine eligibility for federal financial aid. In Maine, it's the form that we use to determine eligibility for the Maine state grant. So there's no extra application just by doing the FAFSA. Students are automatically considered for the Maine state grant. And then most schools use the FAFSA also to determine eligibility for all of their own institutional need-based financial aid. The exception to that is there are a handful of schools that use another form only to determine eligibility for their institutional money. So in Maine, all schools use the FAFSA to determine their money, except for, and maybe you're going to guess this, Bates, Bowdoin, and Colby. So sometimes when there are schools out there that have a ton of their own institutional money, they want to know a little bit more about a family. They want to dig a little bit deeper. And so in those cases, they may require an additional form, in which case it's most often the CSS profile. So just be sure as you're researching schools, you find out what forms are required to apply for financial aid. The FAFSA is a given. I want everyone out there to always be sure they file their FAFSA every single year they're even considering higher education, but be sure whether you know whether or not the CSS profile is going to be needed in addition. Now, what both of these forms do is they produce something called the EFC, that expected family contribution. So you put in all of this information, and what gets spit out is an EFC. And so how a school determines how much need a student has, it's done the same way by every school out there, is they take the total cost to attend that particular school. And of course, that's going to vary by school. Some are going to be relatively affordable. And some schools, to be honest with you, are pushing $80,000 per year now. So they're going to take the cost of their individual school. They're going to subtract out your EFC, and the EFC is a combination, as Mary mentioned, of parent income, sometimes a little bit of parent savings, not much. We hope we've debunked that myth. Student income a little bit, and student savings a little bit potentially. And so that's what makes up that EFC. So you can see here that the student is then going to have a certain amount of need at each individual school. Now, the amount of need that they have depends on the school that they're at. So that's one of the reasons when people say to us, you know, should we just not apply for financial aid if our income is at a certain level? And we say, oh gosh, no, please be sure that you apply for financial aid, because especially if you're attending a higher cost school, you can have a pretty high EFC, or expected family contribution, and still be eligible for financial aid. So that's one of the reasons we want to be sure that everybody applies for financial aid. Now, in a perfect world, every school would meet 100% of that need. So the way that it theoretically should work is that once you know what your need is, you would hope that the school could just give you all of that money. Whatever your need is, they're going to give you financial aid that's equivalent to that. Unfortunately, we're at a point right now where most schools cannot do that. So most schools cannot provide 100% of need. So Mary, if you can go on to the next slide, because if they all did, we probably wouldn't need to be going into this conversation as much as we are. But because they don't, we want you to take a look at schools and research them based on percent of need met. And all we mean here is of the amount of need that a student has, what percentage of it is the school going to be able to meet? We do have some schools out there that can meet 100% of need. There aren't all that many, but we'll talk about them a little bit. And so that's wonderful. But do you know that we have schools out there that are only meeting 40 and 50% of need? Well, I'm not saying that a student shouldn't still apply to those schools, but I want a family to go into that process knowing that on average, those schools don't have as much financial aid as they would like to have and aren't going to be able to provide probably as much financial aid as some other schools. So we want to talk about that more in just a moment. The other really big concept that I think it's important for people to think about as they're going into this process is to focus on what we call the net price and not worry so much about the sticker price. So what the net price is it's the cost of school when you have subtracted out the grants and scholarships. So if you take the cost of a school and you minus out the grants and the scholarships, what's left is what that school is actually going to cost you. Okay, that's going to be your net price. That's what you want to focus on. You actually, even though it's terrifying sometimes to think about these numbers, you actually don't care if a school costs $80,000 if they meet 100% of your need and they're able to give you almost everything that you need to get that bill paid, right? You don't care about the sticker price. What you care about is that net price. So that's a concept that we're going to talk about a lot. And that's why Mary and I are the first ones to say, you don't automatically write off an expensive school, because some of those most expensive schools actually have the best financial aid. And that's why we want you to do this research so you can get a sense of, okay, this expensive school has great financial aid. This expensive school, not so good, okay? So in building your list, you can have that information so you get a good comprehensive list. So we're going to talk in a slide or two about these concepts. But before I do that, I just want to mention that there is a federal site called the College Scorecard site. And we do want you to check that out because there are some other things there that are important to focus on. So when you're looking at schools, you do care about things like graduation rates and some of those other factors like what's the average salary for a student once they graduate from those schools. Those are things that are also interesting and important to know. And so the College Scorecard site is a great place to get some of that information. But Mary, if you can take me to the next slide. What I want to do here is return to that first concept of percent of need met. In my opinion, being able to get this information early can be a real game changer. So many of you, I'm guessing, are familiar with the College Board. The College Board are the SAT people. If you've got kids out there that are taking AP classes, the College Board takes care of that. That CSS profile that I mentioned, that other financial aid form, guess who puts that together? It's the College Board. And what they also have is a section of their website called Big Future. And the Big Future section of the College Board website is absolutely so incredibly helpful when it comes to planning for college. So what you're going to see here is how this site works is it takes like 4,000 schools throughout the US and it has them all in their database. And then you get to determine based on the criteria that's most important to you, you can filter those 4,000 schools down to a much more manageable number. And so when you're filtering, you're looking at the items that you will see on your screen here to the left. You can do filtering based on major. You can do filtering based on the size of school. You can do filtering based on selectivity. You can do filtering based on location. Those are all really important. But what you can also do filtering on is based on the category of paying. When you click on that category, guess what there is? There's something that says percent of need met. So when you're looking at schools and researching, you're saying, I want to study this or that in this location, you can add in, and I only want to look at schools, at least at this point in the process, maybe, that meet at least 60% need or 80% need, or maybe even only 100% need. Your list is going to be a little bit smaller, but this will right from the beginning give you a good sense of, okay, do I have some schools on my list or my child's list that seem to be able to provide pretty good financial aid? Now, that doesn't mean, again, that you're not going to look at schools that don't meet 60 or 80% of need, because, again, these are averages, and we don't want to make final decisions built on averages. But what I do want you to have is to be sure that on that list are some schools that do a good job, on average, of meeting a student's financial need. And this site has all sorts of other great stuff that we can't go into tonight, but you can always reach out to us, and we'd love to share some more stuff about it at any point in time. So then the other concept that we talked about is this concept of net price, that what you really care about is how much is the school going to cost you. So one of the things the federal government started requiring several years ago is that every school have a net price calculator on their website. So if you go to a school's website, typically to the financial aid section, you're going to find that there should be a net price calculator there. And what that net price calculator does is takes you one step even deeper. Because what you can do is you can put in your specific financial information. To be honest with you, information is very similar to what you're going to put on a FAFSA. And the school is going to use their specific information. And what they're going to produce for you is an estimate of what your student might be eligible to receive that first year. So again, your specific information, the school's specific information, giving you an average or an estimate of what your student looks likely to receive their first year. So let's take a look at two schools that I did net price calculators with. I used exactly the same information for both of those schools. So what you're going to see here, and I know this is kind of small to read, and I don't have my glasses on, so I'm looking at just kind of red and blue chunks here, but I know from memory what they have on them. And what you're going to see is these schools both use the same company to do their net price calculator. So it makes it kind of nice because they look the same and it's pretty easy to compare one to the other. These schools are both private schools. They're very similar schools in terms of selectivity and some of those things. But what I want to highlight is, first of all, what the cost of attendance is. So you're going to see that school A is a little bit more expensive than school B. Now, first glance, I don't want you to focus on that. What I want you to focus on is I want you to focus on where they talk about estimated grants and scholarships. That's what you really care about. And you can see that the end result for both of these schools are very different. So school A is going to offer some grants and scholarships, but not as much as school B, okay? So then what they do is they calculate for you your net price, your cost minus grants and scholarships that don't have to be repaid. So you've got that apples to apples comparison right there. And then what they do is they show you a couple of ways in which you can pay any remaining balance through other federal programs like federal work study or federal direct loans. So you can see by doing a net price calculator here, you get a little bit of insight into what the financial aid offer might look like when students get to their senior year if they were to apply to these particular schools. Better to know this now than to be, in the high stressed emotions that come with senior year. Having these conversations early helps you say, okay, well, maybe this one we could do. This one, it might be a little bit tight, and having that kind of dollar amount discussion, as hard as it is, was a lifesaver for us because when we got to senior year, my sons knew exactly what we could afford. Now, one of the other things I want to point out on this is that neither of those schools were meeting 100% need, okay? So even after all of the aid is applied, the grants, the scholarships, the work study, and even the federal student loans, there was still a balance that was higher than what their EFC was. Because if you recall, their EFC for that dollar, that income was about $4,300, okay? So that just demonstrates, unfortunately, that not schools don't all meet 100% need. So one of the things I want to finish up this section on in just a second is I want to talk a little bit about Merit Aid. And so Merit Aid is incredibly important. And what you're going to maybe be surprised about, though, is that the most selective schools don't offer any Merit Aid. They simply look at need-based aid. And this was something I didn't realize until my oldest son was going to school and applying to colleges, and one of our friends, and they did fine financially. They both made really good money. And so they didn't have a lot of financial need. And so when they were looking at schools, they were relying on merit-based aid. And they found that some of the most prestigious, those most selective schools don't offer merit-based aid at all. Colby, Bates, Bowdoin, there is no merit aid offered at those particular schools. But what's equally as interesting is those schools that are the next tier down, those very selective or somewhat selective schools, they do often offer merit aid, and they really use that merit aid to help students afford to come to their schools. That's like the carrot in large part that they're going to use to entice students to come to those schools, because they know that some of those students could go to any school. So to sweeten the pot, they're going to say, hey, but you come here and we have merit money that we're going to offer you. And so it can really make a huge difference. In that net price calculator I used a moment ago, the student had a pretend GPA of 3.5. So the merit aid, you saw that there was some offered. What's interesting is when you're doing the net price calculator, if they ask about GPA, take that GPA up a little, take that GPA down a little bit, and you can kind of see, does the merit aid adjust as the GPA adjusts? So those schools are a really great source for merit-based aid. So I think you definitely want to have some of those schools on your list, even if your student is one of those students who could get into any selective school that they wanted to, it's still a great idea, especially if your EFC is a bit higher, to have some of those other schools on their list just so that they can see what the financial aid offers are going to look like. So we never want people to make final decisions based on the net price calculator, but it is meant to just provide additional information so that you can build that list of schools. So we encourage students to have, somewhere between 4 and 6 schools. It's going to vary. We worry that when students get too far over 10 or so, that's going to be a lot of applications to manage in terms of when they start getting, the admissions applications that they have to do, or more importantly, when they're applying for financial aid, if there are additional steps to take, to do that at 10 or 12 schools becomes a little bit overwhelming. So if students can get a list that's, 4, 6, 8 schools, that seems to be the sweet spot. And this is really, really hard. But if we can have the student not get their heart set on a school early in the process, if students can keep their mind open to the fact that there are multiple schools out there that likely can meet their needs educationally, socially, academically, and just be really flexible, that's going to make a big difference. And we want to be sure that there is basically a financial aid safety school on the list, that even if the financial aid doesn't come through the way that you'd like it to, it's a school that you feel like is still something that you can afford. So, the community college might be an option for that. For other families, a state school might be the option that's considered kind of that financial aid safety school. So it's important to have that as well. So we hope that those pieces of information will help you figure out how to build a list of schools. And I think one of the most perfect times to be building this list of schools is sophomore and junior year. It's not too early to start looking at schools and trying to research schools based on these criteria so that when the student starts senior year and has a ton on their plate, that they're ready to go and they know which schools they want to apply to. All right, I'm going to take a breath. And now we're going to talk about part 3. And so let's fast forward for a moment, everyone. And I want you to imagine that your students are seniors in high school. And so they have gotten their financial aid offers. It's this time, it's February, it's March of senior year. And here's what we would want you to know. So if you are families that are in this situation or will be in the not too distant future, here are some things we really want you to know about making those decisions. So Mary, if you can go to the next slide. So we really want you to be able to make that apples to apples comparison. When we did a net price calculator a moment ago, one of the things is that the fact that those schools both use the same company, you could easily line up those 2 offers and see how they compared to each other. When you get actual financial aid offers, they're all going to look different. They're going to be laid out differently. They're going to offer different types of aid. So you really need to get that apples to apples comparison. And so how you can do that is by using a worksheet that we have or using a worksheet that other people provide, where you look at this apples to apples, meaning that you focus first on the direct costs. You figure out what's the tuition, fees, and room and board at that particular school. I'm not going to worry so much about transportation and books at the moment. I want to focus on what is the bill going to be. And then I want to subtract out those grants and scholarships, right? Because again, that's what the school is really going to cost me. And then I want to look across the way we have our worksheet laid out. I want to look across and see how much is each school costing. Because when a student as a senior gets a scholarship and the school tells them that they've got an academic scholarship for $60,000, they are going to be mind blown. And they're going to think that must be the most affordable school. But if that $60,000 scholarship is over the course of 4 years, and that school is $75,000, we all know that once we do that math, it might not look quite as sweet. That's still great, but doing this apples to apples comparison will give a much better sense of that. And then if students are going to borrow, we do recommend that they borrow federal student loans first. So we want to be sure that they subtract that out. Those are probably going to be the same from one school to the other. And scholarships are important. So we don't want to forget, we got lots of questions about scholarships. We could do a whole session on that, but we do want to be sure that students apply for scholarships. And you can do that by going to our website. Mary's going to put that in the chat as well. We have a free scholarship search, but additionally, you're going to find on that page a bunch of scholarship search tools that are all free and legitimate. So we think that's a great place to start looking for scholarships. Okay. So what's going to happen is you're going to get your financial aid offers. You're going to take a look at them. You're going to have a sense of, okay, this is what this school is going to look like, and here's what the bottom line is at that school. And I hope you're one of those families where you're like, okay, this works. This is great. But I think the reality for many families is that they're going to find that that offer isn't quite enough. They've got a bit of a balance, more than they were prepared for after they've taken into account grants and scholarships and money offered by the school. So what we want you to think about is how you can reduce your expenses to start with. So certainly, we didn't put this in the slide, but certainly if your student is taking college level courses when they're in high school, there may be classes that they don't have to take. Maybe they are going to be able to attend part-time at some point in time. Did you know you can still get financial aid even if you are attending school on a part-time basis in some circumstances? Sometimes students are living home. I'm going to be honest, my youngest son is still living at home. That's saving us a bunch of money while he's going to college and working very well for him. It's not something everyone wants to do, but it is a great cost-saving measure. So think about those things that you can cut. You know, does a student really need a car on campus? Can you cut all of those other expenses to get that bill down as much as possible? Do they need to live in a single and all of those things? Savings is a huge piece of it that Mary focused on a lot in the earlier section. As she mentioned, it has very little impact, if any, on financial aid eligibility. And I think particularly savings in terms of having the conversation with your student about how much they're going to be saving out of their earnings. So the expectation from you, what is it? Are they going to be working over the summer? Great. If they're going to be working over the summer, how much are you expecting them to save? And because I think what can happen is students can work, and you know, my oldest son was one of those who's much better now, but he was a spender. And so he was working, but he was spending every bit of money he was making. So we really had to have that conversation about, hey, this is what the expectation is. I need you to save $1,000 over the summer because we're going to use that to put it towards your bill or to pay your books or whatever might be the case. Again, having that conversation about expectations, not reading each other's minds or trying to, is really important. Tuition payment plans are basically what Mary was mentioning, where you can take look at your family budget, and especially if you've been able to get prepared for this, you may say, you know what, I've got $100 or $200 a month in my family budget. Maybe it's the money I was putting into my savings account or my 529 plan, and I'm going to be able to use that to make payments. A tuition payment plan is not a loan. There is no interest charged. And instead, what it does is it just allows you to spread a portion, just the portion that you desire of the bill out over a series of months. Kind of like I used to do with my oil bill. It just makes it much more manageable. And then, of course, people do look at other financing options like private loans or like plus loans. What we'd love to have you do if you are going to be looking at additional loans is to visit theloanforme.com. It is a section of the FAME. It's connected to the FAME website, and it just offers, you know, really good non-biased information about loans and what you want to be looking into and what you want to be asking for questions so that you can make an informed decision about borrowing. But I think the biggest piece I want you to take away from this is a piecemeal approach. Paying for college is typically a situation where no one thing is going to pay for everything. You are not typically going to get enough financial aid to cover everything. We are not going to be able to save enough to pay for everything. We can't pay for everything out of pocket, at least most of us, right? So a little bit of savings, some financial aid, summer earnings, tuition payment plan, a little bit of loan. When all of those things come together, that's when we find that families have been most effective in paying for college. I can talk fast. Mary, would you like to pick it up from, oh no, I got one more, I'm sorry. I do have one more, sorry. And don't forget about your tax credits and tax deductions. They are not necessarily going to be as helpful that first year, but once your student has been in school, you may find that you pay less in taxes. And guess what? You can take that extra money and you can direct that towards your tuition bills going forward. And Opportunity Maine is just a program that helps students repay their loans. So I'll leave it at that and let Mary go ahead and finish us off.
But one last thing we did want to touch on, and I touched on this briefly in the beginning, but that is the whole conversation around, you know, return on investment. And as you're exploring the various colleges and the financing options and the commitment that both you and your child is making in terms of future loan repayment and all of those factors, you certainly want to spend some time evaluating that ROI or that return on investment. You know, thinking about things and researching, what the future job outlook is for the particular program that the student is pursuing. What are the potential earnings and benefits tied to that career? Are there loan forgiveness options for individuals in that profession? And of course, those things can change over time, but it's an important factor to consider. Really, at the end of the day, by every measure, we know that education and training after high school continues to be extremely valuable and critical to allow students to participate in the economy and be financially successful in the future. But depending on the choices that you make and the loans that you take on, that can really be impacted. And so really taking a close look at that ROI is important and critical as well. Now, to just kind of recap what we've talked about in stages. So certainly as early as possible, but I want to emphasize it's never too late to tackle some of the things Mila and I have talked about. That conversation and focus on finances and getting your financial house in order is really important. Prioritizing saving and having that conversation about your goals and expectations for financing college. Again, Mila mentioned the piecemeal approach. That is really the families that are most successful are using a multiple set of resources and options to get the bill paid. Certainly as sophomore and junior year comes along, the big future resource that she offered, net price calculator, the college scorecard, those are all wonderful resources. And again, if you have a senior or a college student, never too late, but a great set of resources for you to take a look at. And then in senior year, that financial aid process is really, that's the time where you'll begin to do that, the FAFSA completion. One thing to note, it's not a one-time process. I'm sorry to say that you will have to do the FAFSA every single year. It gets a little bit easier, but senior year is when that process will begin, and you'll be going through that comparison of awards, apple to apples comparison, as Mila mentioned. The other tool that we recommend, and this is very helpful in the ROI, Mila put in the chat the Career One Stop tool to get a handle on salary. But you can also use FAME's student loan salary debt calculator that gives you an idea of, depending on your expected salary, what the maximum amount of student loan is that a student should be borrowing. And then last but not least, we want you to be aware that FAME has a ton of resources and tools. All of the links are there, and Mila will share them in the chat. But I want you to know that this spring, starting in March, throughout the spring, we do have a series of information sessions where we do a deeper dive into the financial aid process. We'll answer a lot of the questions that I saw tonight in terms of FAFSA filing. We also have some wonderful informational videos that are really helpful, so I encourage you to use those and to seek out FAME's expertise. Again, we'll meet with you one-on-one in a Zoom session. We'll chat with you over the phone. Whatever we can do to help you along the way, we are certainly here. And then in closing, I think we've touched on this throughout, really creating as many scenarios as possible will lead to future success for your student child. I think emphasizing that there are multiple pathways to get to that end result, and the end result is we want our kids to be happy, have a great job that they love, and with a salary that allows them to have the freedom to choose the life that they're seeking. And so, but there's lots of ways to get there. There isn't one path. There's lots of options, many different types of programs, apprenticeships, 1-year, 2-year programs, and beyond. There's no one way that works for everyone or is best for everyone. The other thing I want to mention, and this we experience and hear this a lot from the families that we work with, it's important to remember that this is not this financing process that you go through. This isn't a 1-year, one-time process. We get very concerned about parents and families who they just worry about getting the bill paid that 1 year, and they're not thinking about, they've got 2 or 4 or more years ahead or more children in many cases to finance. And then last but not least, living on the cheap and making sacrifices while in school, and this is really targeted at the student, will allow for more financial freedom and later in life. We often say live like a student while you're a student, so you don't have to live like a student when you're an adult. And I think we've, in some cases, lost sight of that in some ways. And so really living frugally is critically important. And so we have just a couple minutes left for questions, and we've been answering the questions all along. But one I did, and I've gone through, and Mila answered many, and I've answered some as well. And I know you had lots of questions when you registered, but one thing I thought perhaps Mila might answer, I think we both certainly have thoughts on it, is we had a question about if a state university offers financial aid in the form of merit-based scholarships, is it okay to contact them to negotiate for a better scholarship if your student has a very high GPA? And Mila, I know we both have probably very similar thoughts on this, but to talk a little bit about negotiation and how you approached that topic.
Yeah, so I think it's always a great idea to have a conversation with schools, whether it be with the admissions office, especially if your student is close to, the threshold of where they might have made a decision, and absolutely with a financial aid office. Mary and I both worked in a financial aid office, and I think one of the things that we most enjoyed was talking with parents, understanding their financial situation. Because one thing I want you to always keep in mind is that all a school knows about you is what's on that financial aid application. They don't know anything more about you. So like going through this pandemic, if families have had an impact on their financial situation, or they've had health issues, high medical bills, the schools don't know that. So whether it's having a conversation with the admissions office to talk about merit aid and just maybe talking about some things that your student has been through, and if there are any other options available, or especially having a conversation with the financial aid office to explain more that's going on so that they know about that and they have an opportunity to do something about that, I think that's always a good idea. I think schools will be put off a bit by the concept of negotiating, but I think you sharing your information and asking them, I think the other thing that's really important is to say, here's what we can do. We want to do everything we can, and here's how we can contribute. But is there any way you can meet us a little closer to the middle? And I think that approach, they'll really will want to work with you.
That's great. Thank you, Mila. So in closing, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Linda, just to let you know, there are some questions that we didn't get to in the chat, but Linda and the team at Town & Country will be sending a follow-up email, and we will share all of the links that we've provided in the webinar. There will be a recording available, the slides will be available, and we will answer some of those questions as well. And just to, again, reiterate, check out the FAME events page, because many of the questions that folks have had, both in the registration and just now in the chat, we will be addressing in our future webinars. So investment options, retirement versus saving for college, comparing financial aid awards, all of those things we will be addressing in upcoming sessions. So we encourage you to take a look at that.
Yeah, Mary, can I just say one thing real quick? Because I know that people did mention a couple things about the investment piece. I think that if people can check out that Saving for College site, one of the things that site has available is there's an interactive chart that you can do. So you can compare different options, and they'll lay it out all sorts of different criteria, the pros and cons of each. So in the meantime, if you wanted to check that out, I think you'll find some really good information there.
Thank you so much for the presentation. What amazing information. Thank you. And if you haven't had a chance, as you can see by the slide up on the screen, we really would appreciate your feedback. So you can just take a picture of the QR code, and there's a short little survey, feedback survey, which we really hope that you'll take a minute to complete. And I want to also, on behalf of Town & Country, thank you for participating, and know that you can reach out to us with your questions about most money questions. We can help you with taking a look at things like, one of the questions that came up on the chat was, can you use a home equity loan? Reach out to us to talk about your options, how to get started with savings for yourself or for getting your kids started on their savings. So we're here to help you. You can learn more about what Town & Country has to offer at tcfcu.com. And as Mary and Mila said, we will be sending out an email with the video and lots of links as follow-up. So Thank you all for joining us, and we hope you have a great night.